Welcome back to The Boring Historian. If you enjoy these long, slow history journeys, perfect for falling asleep or just relaxing, please consider subscribing. It helps keep the channel going and lets me keep bringing you more of these gentle stories from the past. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd like to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what's the time there right now? Maybe it's early morning with a cup of tea. Maybe it's just past midnight and you're winding down. Or maybe it's that quiet hour when the rest of the world is asleep. Let me know in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Tonight's topic is not the glory of Rome. It's not emperors, or conquests, or golden sunsets over the Forum. Instead, we're going to talk about something far more ordinary, and, in many ways, far more dangerous. Winter specifically, why you dropped into ancient Rome without preparation. Wouldn't tea survive even a single one of its winters? This will be a slow journey. We'll walk the narrow streets together, feel the chill seeping into our bones, smell the smoke of damp wood, and hear the muffled coughs of neighbors through thin walls. And perhaps, by the end, you'll understand why the romantic image of Rome so often leaves out the long, cold months between November and March. It begins not with a storm, but with something quieter, almost polite in its arrival. The long golden days of autumn fade slowly into a pale, washed-out light. The sky loses its depth of blue, turning soft and flat, and the shadows in the streets seem to arrive a little earlier each afternoon. The sun that once pressed warmly against your shoulders now feels weaker, as if it no longer has the strength to do much more than illuminate the day. In the Subura, your neighborhood, dense, noisy, and packed with narrow streets, the signs of the season's change are everywhere. In the summer, linen tunics hung from upper windows, snapping lightly in the warm breeze, and the air was thick with the smell of bread and fresh herbs. But now, in late November, those same streets are quieter, colors dulled to shades of brown and gray. The air bites a little when you breathe in. People walk faster, heads bent, cloaks pulled tight around them. The familiar smell of Rome, a mixture of bread, oil, and human life, has shifted. It carries now the faint, sharp scent of smoke from damp wood and the sourness of wet wool drying slowly indoors. Inside your home, the cold is sharper still. You live in an insula, one of Rome's towering apartment blocks, and your room is on an upper floor, where the walls are thin and the draft stronger. There is no insulation, no glass in the window frame, only wooden shutters that rattle when the wind pushes against them. At night, the air seeps through the cracks and wraps itself around you, settling into your bones. You wake in the dim early light to see your breath clouding in front of you, the thin wool blanket doing little to keep you warm. For a moment, you hesitate before getting up, because you know the floor, stone-worn smooth by years of footsteps, will be as cold as the night itself. When you finally rise, you dress quickly, pulling your tunic over your head, the rough wool scratching your arms. You wrap your cloak tightly, pinning it at the shoulder, though it is already worn thin from years of use. Your sandals, made of stretched leather, are no match for the damp. And the thought of stepping outside into the wet morning makes you pull the cloak even closer. Rome, you quickly realize, is not built for warmth unless you are among the very rich. The wealthy live in villas with hypo-cost heating, a luxury system of warm air running beneath the floors. But even they only heat a few rooms at a time. The rest of the population, the vast majority, must make do with smaller comforts. A brazier of glowing charcoal if they can afford the fuel, a shared bed for warmth, or simply the habit of enduring the cold without complaint. Even the brazier is dangerous. In these crowded buildings with poor ventilation, it can quietly fill a room with deadly fumes. And every winter brings stories of whole families found still and cold in the morning, the last of their charcoal smoldering beside them. Your first task of the day is to fetch water. The streets are wet from last night's rain, and the cobblestones glisten under the pale sun. The city feels slower in winter, though still alive in its own way. Bakers are already pulling flat loaves from their ovens, steam curling into the morning air. Fishmongers unroll their coverings, revealing salted mullet, sardines, and the occasional fresh catch from the coast. You pass them without stopping and join the short queue at the fountain. The aqueducts feed these public fountains, their water flowing steadily from carved stone lion heads into wide basins. You bend to fill your amphora, the icy water running over your fingers until they ache. Lifting the jar to your shoulder, you feel the cold seeping through your cloak as you make the short walk back. Breakfast is plain, a piece of yesterday's bread, hard at the edges, dipped in a little olive oil if there's any left. Fresh fruit is rare now, and you save your dried figs for better days. The bread is dense and cold from sitting out overnight. You eat it slowly, not because you wish to savor it, but because there is no reason to hurry. And perhaps, Stretching the act of eating makes you feel a little warmer. By midday, the truth of winter in Rome begins to reveal itself. It is not a season that will kill you outright, not all at once. Instead, it will wear you down, bit by bit. The damp will linger in your bones, the cold will sap your energy, and each small discomfort, the chill in the air, the shortage of food, the coughs and fevers that pass quickly from neighbor to neighbor, will slowly accumulate until the season has taken everything from you. Today you will get by, perhaps tomorrow as well. But the weeks ahead, those are another matter entirely. This is only the beginning. By the second week of cold weather, you begin to notice it most clearly not in your bones, but on your plate. The diet of a Roman winter is a lesson in limitation. In summer, the market stalls overflowed with figs, so ripe their skins split under the touch. Grapes heavy with sweetness, baskets of leafy greens, and bright gourds in every shape. But now, as December approaches, the colors of the market fade to dull earth tones, browns, grays, and the occasional muted green of a leek or cabbage. There are no green beans, no cucumbers, no melons. What remains is the food that can survive weeks, even months, without spoiling. It is a season built on storage and preservation. Grain is the foundation, it always has been, but now it dominates. Wheat for the wealthy, barley for the poor. The grain is milled into coarse flour, baked into bread, or boiled into a thick, porridge-like pools. The bread is not the soft, fragrant kind you might imagine from modern bakeries. It is dense, heavy, and sometimes flecked with bits of grit from imperfect milling, which wear down your teeth over years. You eat it because you must, not because you enjoy it. Olive oil is another staple, though its price can rise in winter, especially if the harvest has been poor. It is used sparingly, as both food and fuel for lamps, which means every drop counts. Protein, for most people, comes in the form of dried or salted fish, mullet, sardines, or anchovies, preserved in barrels with layers of coarse salt. These are not eaten fresh and delicate, but tough and briny, their strong flavor often masking the taste of bread that has gone stale. Meat is a rare luxury in the colder months, unless you live in the countryside and can slaughter your own animals. Even then, preservation is the key. Salted pork, cured sausages, or smoked cuts that can last through the season. Fresh meat, unless consumed immediately, will spoil quickly without ice. Chickpeas, lentils, and beans step in to fill the gap, boiled into soups with onions, leeks, or cabbage when available. Perhaps the strangest comfort in winter is garum, the fermented fish sauce, beloved across the empire. It is made by layering fish innards with salt and leaving them to liquefy under the sun for weeks or months, then straining the result into a pungent amber-colored liquid. In summer, its sharp aroma mixes with the heat and can be overwhelming. But in winter, when the cold dulls the senses, garum becomes a small burst of flavor in an otherwise bland diet. You drizzle it over lentils, stir it into soups, or dip bread into it when the olive oil runs low. Fruit in winter is scarce, but not absent. Wealthier households enjoy preserved figs, dates imported from the east, or apples stored in cool cellars. Dried grapes, raisins, are common enough, though their price can climb if the summer's harvest was poor. For the poorer classes, sweet things become rare treats. Honey, too, is precious and kept for the sick or for religious offerings. In its absence, the season's food feels plain, unchanging. The rhythm of the day revolves around meals that are less about variety than survival. In the morning, you might break your fast with bread and oil, or bread dipped in watered-down wine to soften it. The main meal, eaten in the afternoon, is a larger portion of bread, maybe a bowl of pools flavored with vegetables or beans, and, if you are lucky, a scrap of salted fish or sausage. In the evening, another smaller meal, often the same as the mornings, before darkness and cold send you to bed early. You begin to feel the effects after a few weeks. There is no shortage of calories if you have enough grain, but there is a sameness to it that wears on the spirit. The lack of fresh greens and fruits slowly drains your strength in ways you do not immediately notice. Cuts heal more slowly, colds linger longer, and the smallest illness can take on a heavier weight. For the poorest, hunger is always a shadow in winter. A bad harvest, or disruption in grain supply from Egypt, can turn a hard season into a deadly one. The city has faced it before, the grain ships delayed by storms, the market stalls emptying, and the bread ration shrinking until tempers flare. For now, the grain supply is steady, and you eat enough to stay alive. But even in the heart of the empire, the abundance of Rome is an illusion in winter. The great marble halls of the Senate may still serve banquets with roasted game, figs stuffed with nuts, and wine warmed with spices, but in the insulae, the cold stone walls close in, and your meals are a reminder that nature, not Rome, decides what you will eat. In the depth of an ancient Roman winter, the difference between comfort and misery comes down to a simple thing: fire. Yet in the cramped heart of the city, fire is as much a danger as it is a salvation. Rome has no forests within its walls. Wood must be brought in from the surrounding countryside or from the distant Apennines. The wealthy, with their courtyards and storerooms, can keep piles of logs stacked high and dry, ready to feed their braziers and stoves all winter. For the rest, warmth comes in smaller, more precarious forms, and every ember is precious. In your insula, there is no grand hearth, no chimneyed fireplace. Instead, heat comes from a portable brazier, a shallow metal pan on a stand, filled with glowing charcoal. The charcoal burns slowly, giving off a steady warmth, but it also produces smoke and invisible fumes. The problem is the same every year. To keep the cold out, you shut the wooden shutters tight. But in doing so, you trap the smoke inside. If the smoke doesn't choke you, the carbon monoxide might. Stories of whole families found dead beside a still warm brazier are not cautionary tales. They are facts of city life. You learn to keep a crack in the window, even if it means the wind slips in to gnaw at your toes. The act of keeping a brazier lit is itself a daily struggle. Charcoal is costly, and poor households cannot afford to keep it burning from dawn to dusk. Instead, you might light it in the evening, after the day's errands are done, huddling with your neighbors around its glow. In the morning, you rise to a room that is colder than the streets outside, your breath a visible cloud in the air. Lighting a fire from scratch each day wastes fuel, so you bank the embers under a layer of ash before you sleep, hoping they will smolder through the night. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you wake to find the brazier stone cold, the ash hiding nothing but the memory of heat. In the wealthier districts, villas have the hypocaust, a marvel of Roman engineering. It is a floor raised on small pillars, with hot air from a furnace flowing beneath, warming the room from the ground up. The air escapes through flues in the walls, heating the bathhouses, dining rooms, and private chambers. To step barefoot onto a hypocaust floor in winter is to feel the luxury of being Roman at its peak. But for most citizens, such warmth is a rumor, a story told by those who have served in noble houses or worked as attendants in the public baths. Speaking of baths, they are one of the few places where the common people can find reliable heat. The thermae, Rome's great public bath complexes, are kept warm year-round, fueled by massive furnaces that consume staggering amounts of wood. In winter they become more than places for bathing. They are sanctuaries of warmth where you can thaw your fingers and toes, wash away the grime of the streets, and spend a few hours in comfort before returning to the cold. But even here, there are limits. The caldarium, with its hot water and steam, feels like paradise, until you step back into the open air. The chill hits you harder then, sinking into your damp skin, and you wrap your cloak tighter as you hurry home, steam still curling from your hair. At night, warmth becomes a communal affair. Families and even unrelated tenants will share a bed, pressing clothes under a heap of blankets and cloaks. This is not the romance of shared comfort, but the necessity of survival. Alone, you lose heat too quickly. Together you can trap enough to keep your core warm until morning. The poor may also sleep in the same room as their animals, goats, dogs, even chickens, letting the body heat of beasts mingle with their own. It is not elegant, but it works. The city itself bears the scars of its relationship with fire. Winter is the season when accidents happen. A brazier tipped over, a roof catching alight, and in moments an entire block can be gone. The flames leap from building to building, fueled by dry timbers and the close press of wooden balconies. Every Roman knows the fear of waking to the shouts of Ignis and the smell of smoke. And yet, despite the danger, there is no living without fire in the cold months. In the still hours before dawn, you sit before your brazier, the charcoal hissing softly, casting a small circle of orange light. Outside, the streets are dark and quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the clatter of a cart on the stones. Your hands hover over the coals, palms tingling as the warmth seeps in. You know the brazier will not last until morning. Soon you will bank the embers again, crawl into bed, and pray that when you wake, the cold has not crept too far into your bones. Winter in Rome does not forgive those who take warmth for granted. Every spark is survival. When the first bite of winter air settles over Rome, you quickly discover another truth about life in the ancient city. Clothing was never really designed with the cold in mind. Rome, after all, is a Mediterranean city, and its fashions are born from a climate of warm summers and mild springs. The same light tunics and airy togas that let you move comfortably under the summer sun become a thin, almost laughable barrier against the bitter winds of January. Your basic winter wardrobe starts with the tunica, the simple garment worn by everyone, rich and poor alike. It is a rectangular piece of woven wool folded and stitched at the sides, belted at the waist, and falling to the knees or calves. In summer, it is made from lighter fabric, but in winter, the wool is thicker. Still, not thick enough. Underneath, you might wear a simple linen shift, or nothing at all, for underwear as we think of it today doesn't truly exist. The moment a cold wind catches the edge of your tunic, it cuts right through you. Over the tunic comes the toga if you are a citizen, but here is the problem. The toga is a massive heavy garment of wool, sometimes weighing 20 pounds, yet it is meant for public display, not practical warmth. It drapes and folds in a way that leaves gaps, allowing drafts to sneak in. It is a statement of status, not survival. Senators may strut through the forum wrapped in their snowy white toga candida, but they still shiver beneath it, teeth clenched against the wind. Those who value warmth over fashion turn instead to the pianula, a cloak of heavy wool or leather, often with a hood. It is the true winter armor of the Roman streets, the garment of travelers, soldiers, and anyone with sense enough to choose practicality over prestige. The wealthy can afford fine cloaks lined with fur, often imported from colder parts of the empire, fox, hare, or even wolf pelts stitched along the edges. For the poor, fur is rare and precious. Instead, they layer what they can: patched wool cloaks, old blankets, even sacks with holes cut for arms. Shoes are another matter entirely. Roman sandals, the calcae or calagae, are made for walking in heat, not snow. They are leather soles strapped to the foot with cords, leaving the toes and much of the top of the foot exposed. In winter, you wrap your feet in strips of cloth or stuff them with wool to keep them warm, but the damp still seeps in. The streets of Rome may not see deep snow often, but winter rain turns the paving stones slick, and the chill rises from them into your very bones. Head coverings are surprisingly rare among Romans, except for certain hoods on cloaks or the practical pileus, a simple felt cap. For much of the population, your head is left bare to the cold, perhaps shielded only by the edge of your cloak. Ears go numb quickly in the biting wind, and you find yourself instinctively hunching your shoulders, trying to tuck your head down for warmth. Gloves are a luxury almost unknown. The wealthy may have fur-lined hand coverings, but most people simply pull their cloak tighter and keep their hands tucked under it. Inside your insula, clothing takes on another role: insulation against the chill that seeps through the walls. You sleep in the same tunic you wore during the day, perhaps adding a second if you are fortunate enough to own one. A cloak doubles as a blanket at night, spread over straw bedding. Wool is scratchy, heavy, and holds the faint smell of the sheep it came from, but it is the only thing keeping you from freezing. Washing clothes in winter is an ordeal. Water is frigid, drying takes days, and every layer you remove is one less you have for warmth. People wear the same garments for weeks, and the air inside the rooms is thick with the mingled scent of smoke, wool, and unwashed fabric. For soldiers on the frontier, Roman ingenuity goes a step further. They are issued bracca, woolen trousers borrowed from the northern tribes the Romans once mocked for their strange dress. In Rome itself, trousers are rare, even frowned upon, seen as barbarian attire. But in the biting wind of the open countryside, practicality triumphs over fashion. The winter teaches you quickly. There is no shame in layering every scrap of cloth you own. Still, the cold always finds a way in. It creeps through the open weave of wool, slides down your neck, and settles in your joints. Your fingers grow stiff, your toes numb, and no matter how tightly you wrap yourself, there comes a moment each night when you wake, shivering, your breath a pale ghost in the darkness. You dream of spring, of sunlight warm enough to make you forget how heavy the cloak feels on your shoulders. Until then, you move through the city like everyone else in winter, a shapeless, hooded figure wrapped in layers, surviving not in style, but in spite of it. The Romans knew the turning of the seasons intimately, not through calendars or clocks alone, but in the way the light itself seemed to vanish from the world. In summer, the sun was a golden ruler, rising early and blazing over the tiled rooftops until evening, flooding the city with warmth. By midwinter, that same sun was a timid, reluctant guest. It climbed late, hung low in the sky, and retreated before you'd even finished your day's work. In the heart of December, the day shrinks to less than 9 hours of light. Even when the sun is technically present, it feels more like a pale lantern than a blazing star. Shadows stretch endlessly along the forum's paving stones. Marble buildings that once glowed white now seem gray, their details swallowed in a dull, cold haze. The sky is often heavy with clouds, thick leaden sheets that press down on the city, muting both color and sound. Without artificial lighting as we know it, the Roman day is bound tightly to the sun's schedule. Lamps and torches provide some relief, but they are dim, flickering, and costly to keep fueled. Oil must be purchased, and for the poor, a lamp burning all night is a luxury they can't afford. In your insula you light a small clay lamp when evening comes, the flame fed by a thin wick floating in olive oil. It casts a warm circle barely larger than your hands, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Your eyes strain in the dimness, and the flicker makes it difficult to read or sew for long. Work shifts with the sun's absence. Market stalls open later, close earlier. Public life contracts, the chatter in the forum is replaced by the sound of shutters slamming against their frames. Night comes swiftly and without ceremony. One moment, the alleys are alive with the clatter of sandals and the calls of vendors. The next, they are dark, their inhabitants vanished indoors, leaving the streets to stray dogs and the occasional torch-bearing patrol. The cold intensifies after sunset. Without the sun's weak warmth, the air turns sharper, the dampness heavier. Inside, there is no refuge from the darkness. You can only retreat to bed earlier, curling under blankets, not from tiredness, but from the need to conserve body heat. Conversations become shorter, meals are eaten quickly, and every gesture is done close to the fire, if you're lucky enough to have one. The absence of light does more than slow the body, it works on the mind. Romans were no strangers to superstition, and winter's long nights fed fears of unseen things. In the countryside, people told stories of spirits wandering in the cold, of omens carried on the wind. In the city, shadows played tricks on the eyes, turning an empty doorway into a lurking figure. For the lonely, the darkness made the walls seem closer, the nights longer, and the cold deeper. Festivals like Saturnalia, held in late December, offered a brief reprieve. Fires were lit in abundance, candles burned in windows, and the streets for once glowed with warmth and noise. But these moments were short-lived. Once the feast days ended, the city returned to its winter silence, and the sun, though slowly lengthening its stay, remained a meager companion. You begin to measure your life not by the hours of the day, but by the quality of the light. There is morning gray, a pale noon, and the deep blue-black of night. Sometimes a rare winter day comes clear and bright, the sunlight reflecting off the marble and the Tiber in brilliant flashes. On such days, the city seems to remember its grandeur. People linger in the streets, turning their faces to the warmth. But these are gifts, not guarantees. For most of winter, Rome feels suspended in a kind of twilight. Work is done in half-light, meals are cooked in shadows, and your own shadow seems to accompany you everywhere, longer, taller, sometimes stretching ahead of you like a ghost. You count the days until the sun reclaims its place, until the warmth returns, until the shadows shorten and the stone beneath your feet no longer feels like walking on ice. But for now, you endure, living in a world that wakes late and sleeps early, where every moment of sunlight feels borrowed, and the night is always waiting just around the corner. If the cold is a constant enemy in a Roman winter, the damp is its silent accomplice. It seeps into everything, your clothes, your bedding, the walls themselves, until even in moments when the air feels still, there is a chill clinging to you that refuses to be shaken off. This is not the clean, crisp cold of mountain air. It is heavy, lingering moisture that rides the river breezes from the Tiber and settles in every crack of the city. The problem begins with Rome's own foundations. The city is built on a series of hills, but its heart, the low-lying forum and surrounding neighborhoods, sits in a basin where fog and mist collect. Winter rains swell the Tiber, and though the great river is the lifeblood of the city, in winter it becomes a damp, creeping influence. Streets close to the banks smell faintly of wet earth and rotting vegetation, and in the mornings, a fine dew covers the paving stones, making them slick underfoot. In your insula, the battle against damp is relentless. These apartment buildings are made of brick and mortar, sometimes mixed with wood, with plaster walls that absorb the winter moisture like a sponge. On a dry summer day you might feel the heat radiating from these walls well into the night. In winter they hold on to the cold instead. Touching the wall in the morning feels like pressing your palm against a slab of stone left out in the frost. The corners grow darker with spots of mold, black or green patches creeping like an illness across the plaster. Bedding never feels entirely dry. Even when wrapped in wool, the moisture finds its way in, leaving a faint chill in the fabric. Cloaks hung near the door take days to dry after being caught in the rain. and they smell of wet wool until you finally risk wearing them again. The poor have little choice but to reuse damped clothing, to put on a cloak that is still cool from yesterday's rain, because it is the only one they own. Fire offers some relief, but it is a double-edged sword. A brazier or small hearth will warm the room, but the smoke can hang heavy in the air, especially if the flue is poorly built or the wood is green. Ventilation means letting in the cold, and so you find yourself in a cycle, sealing the room against drafts to keep the heat, only to trap the dampness inside with you. The Romans had no concept of modern waterproofing. Roof tiles shifted over time, and gaps between them let in drips during a storm. In wealthier homes, gutters carried water away, but in many tenements it simply pooled in corners of the floor or dripped into clay jars hastily set beneath leaks. You learn to identify the smell of rain before it arrives, that earthy mineral taint that tells you the damp is about to deepen. Dampness also carried health risks. Romans did not speak in the language of germs and bacteria, but they knew that cold, wet conditions brought sickness. They feared catarrhs, a catch-all term for respiratory illnesses, and believed the damp could enter the body through the pores, settling in the chest. Coughing fits and lingering fevers became common in winter, especially among the poor who could not afford enough fuel for fires. Children and the elderly suffered most, their bodies unable to shake the constant chill. The wealthy fought dampness with architecture. Their villas often had hypocost heating systems, underfloor channels that carried warm air from a furnace into the rooms above. But such luxuries were rare in the cramped tenements of the city. For most Romans, the only real weapon was the careful tending of small fires, the use of heavy wool, and the discipline of drying clothing near the brazier whenever possible. Even then, you could never truly win. You could only manage the damp, never banish it entirely. Perhaps the most frustrating part is how stealthy it is. On some days, you step outside and think, today feels dry. But by the time you return home, your cloak is heavy with the invisible weight of moisture, your sandals damp from the paving stones, and the air in your room has the same faint mustiness as always. The damp is not loud or violent like a storm. It is patient, creeping, waiting. You begin to understand why Romans longed for the return of spring. It wasn't only the warmth they craved, but the drying of the air, the feeling of fabrics crisping in the sun, the scent of walls baked clean by heat. Until then, you live with the damp as a quiet, unwelcome guest, one you cannot throw out, one that sits with you through every long winter night. In Rome, winter was not just a matter of cold, it was a matter of scarcity. Food, which in the warmer months flowed into the markets in a dizzying variety, became a daily concern. This was the season the wealthy could ride out in comfort, their storerooms stocked with amphorae of oil and grain, their kitchens still humming with activity. But for the average Roman, winter could be the thin edge of hunger. The city depended heavily on grain shipments, much of it coming from Egypt across the Mediterranean. In summer and autumn, these ships arrived steadily, unloading their precious cargo at Ostia before it was brought upriver to the city. But in winter, the seas turned treacherous. Strong winds, sudden storms, and high waves made sailing dangerous, and the shipping lanes slowed to a trickle. The granaries still held reserves. Rome's leaders knew too well the political danger of empty stomachs, but those reserves were meant to be stretched. Bread was still available, but the price of everything else rose. The bustling markets of summer, overflowing with figs, grapes, olives, and fresh greens, now looked subdued. There were dried goods aplenty, beans, lentils, salted fish, and dried fruit. But freshness was rare. Vegetables were whatever could survive the cold. Hardy cabbages, leeks, onions, and even these cost more than they had a few months before. If you were poor, you learned to make do with the cheapest staples, stretching grain, porridge into multiple meals, and seasoning it with whatever scraps you could find. Meat, always a relative luxury for common Romans, became even rarer. Without refrigeration, slaughtering was seasonal, and most livestock was kept alive as long as possible for milk, wool, or labor. Winter slaughtering happened mainly in rural areas, where meat could be smoked, salted, or dried. In the city, this meant that the fresh cuts in the butcher's stalls were few and costly. The poor turned instead to sausages, offal, or salted fish. Less glamorous fare, but filling when mixed with bread or pulses. Wine, of course, was never in short supply, but in winter it often came from the bottom of the amphora, thicker, rougher, more sour. The wealthy had fine wines stored in sealed jars, their flavors preserved for years. The poor might drink it watered down and spiced, not for taste but for warmth. A hot drink, even if just mulled wine or a thin soup, could turn a cold evening bearable. Hunger in Rome was not necessarily starvation, though in particularly bad winters, that could happen, but a slow wearing down. Meals became smaller, less varied. You might feel a faint ache in your stomach at night and know there was no more to eat until morning. Energy waned, work felt harder, tempers shorter. For children, winter meant fewer treats and a reliance on filling, but bland, staples. There was also a mental weight to it. The poorer citizens knew that food shortages could spark unrest. In extreme cases, grain riots erupted, forcing magistrates to open the reserves early. People would gather in the forum, shouting for bread, accusing merchants of hoarding or cheating. Winter was a season in which the gap between the wealthy and the poor was most visible. The rich dining in heated rooms, the poor clutching loaves as though they were gold. Some turned to ingenuity. Rural relatives might send preserved goods, dried figs, salted olives, nuts, to city family. Others foraged outside the walls for edible greens, mushrooms, or nuts. Street vendors adjusted their trade, selling hot chestnuts, chickpea pancakes, or thick soups ladled from steaming pots, the smell drawing in customers even if the taste was humbled. Still, you could not escape the fact that winter was lean. The feasts of Saturnalia were the exception, a burst of abundance and generosity, before returning to the careful rationing of everyday life. When spring finally came and the markets filled again with fresh produce, the city seemed to exhale in relief. Until then, winter in Rome was endured with a cautious eye on the pantry. The stomach always aware of its own emptiness, and the mind always thinking about the next meal. In the depths of a Roman winter, warmth is not a luxury, it is a daily battle. The city has no central heating, no glass-paned windows to keep the cold out. The walls of your insula are thick enough to hold the structure upright, but they are not made to trap heat. If you want warmth, you must make it yourself, and in ancient Rome, that means fire. For the wealthy, fire was a controlled, elegant servant. In their villas, flames glowed in well-built hearths, the smoke neatly carried away by chimneys or vents. Some even had hypocaust systems, ingenious networks of empty spaces beneath floors and within walls, through which hot air from a furnace flowed, gently heating the rooms above. But such marvels were rare and expensive. In the cramped apartments of the poor, fire was a much more fragile, fickle, and sometimes dangerous companion. Most insulae tenants relied on braziers, simple, portable metal or clay containers filled with burning charcoal. They were small enough to move from one room to another, but this convenience came with risk. The embers had to be carefully managed, as a single spark could leap onto a wooden beam or floorboard and start a fire that might consume the entire building. Worse still, the smoke from charcoal is invisible yet deadly. In a sealed room, it could suffocate you before morning. Every winter, Rome saw fires and poisonings alike, both blamed on these humble but hazardous braziers. Fuel itself was another concern, which was expensive within the city, especially in winter, when demand was high. Wealthier families could afford fine, dry logs that burned cleanly. The poor often made do with cheaper, resinous wood, damp sticks, or even scraps from workshops, all of which smoked heavily and burned unevenly. Charcoal was cleaner and hotter, but it, too, had a price, and you might find yourself using less than you needed just to make it last the week. The smoke was inescapable without modern chimneys in most apartments. You had to let smoke escape through an open doorway or window, but that meant letting the cold in. So you compromised, crack the door, let the smoke drift out slowly, and live with a haze in the room that stung the eyes and left the walls coated in a thin film of soot. Over time, everything, your clothes, your bedding, even your hair, took on the faint, bitter scent of smoke. Keeping the fire going was a constant task. In the mornings, you might find the embers from the night before have died to a few stubborn glows. You stir them, feed them bits of kindling, and blow until the tiny sparks bloom into a flame again. On windy days, you huddle close to the brazier, cupping your hands over the warmth, feeling the heat seep slowly into your stiff fingers. The warmth is never enough to chase away the cold entirely. It is more like a bubble of comfort that exists only within arm's reach of the fire. Step away, and the chill closes in again. In some neighborhoods, the air itself felt heavier in winter from the countless small fires burning behind every door. Even the great public baths, one of the few truly warm places in the city during winter, added their share of smoke to the air, their massive furnaces roaring day and night to keep the pools heated. On certain days, the smell of burning wood and charcoal seemed to linger in every breath you took. Still, despite the smoke, despite the risks, fire was life. Without it, you could not cook. Without it, you could not dry your clothing after a winter rain. Without it, the cold would gnaw into your bones until even sleep offered no relief. Every Roman in winter, rich or poor, understood this truth. The struggle for warmth was not about comfort, it was about survival. You learned to tend your fire like a friend, feed it carefully, shield it from drafts, never let it burn too low, and always be ready to start it again. For in Rome's damp, restless winter, the cold was patient. It only needed a few hours without flame to creep back in and claim your home once more. In ancient Rome, winter was not marked by snow, but by water. The rains came in sheets, sometimes lasting days without pause, turning streets into slick, glistening channels and filling the air with a constant hiss. This was not the gentle patter of spring showers. These were heavy, soaking rains, falling from low gray skies that seemed to press down upon the city. The heart of Rome was shaped around the Tiber River, a lifeline for trade, transport, and water supply, but also a temperamental neighbor. In summer it ran low and brown, slow-moving under the sun. In winter the rain swelled it into a force of nature. Tributaries poured their runoff into the main current, and the river rose quickly, sometimes alarmingly so. When the Tiber flooded, the low-lying areas, particularly the Forum Boarium, the old cattle market, and the neighborhoods near the riverbanks, suffered first. Water seeped into basements, then surged into streets, carrying with it mud, refuse, and debris from upstream. Shops near the quays had to shutter quickly, hauling their goods to higher ground. Boats became the only safe way to move through certain streets, and even then, the strong current could overturn the careless or unlucky. For ordinary citizens, the flooding was both an inconvenience and a danger. The water carried the filth of the city, animal waste, rotting food, and human refuse from the sewers, spreading it into homes and workshops. Illness often followed in the wake of such floods, as drinking water sources became contaminated. Those living in the poorest quarters could lose everything in a single night. Bedding, clothing, food stores, all ruined by the brown, reeking floodwater. Even when the river stayed in its banks, the winter rains changed daily life. Rome's streets were paved, but not all evenly, and the stone slabs became slick underfoot. The raised stepping stones, placed at intervals across the roads, allowed pedestrians to cross without stepping directly into the muck. But in winter, the spaces between them filled with cold, dirty water, splashing up with each passing cartwheel. Cloaks grew heavy with damp, and leather sandals softened unpleasantly, leaving toes chilled and numb. Buildings were not immune. Roofs of terracotta tiles often leaked if not well maintained, and poorer houses with thatched or flat roofs were even more vulnerable. Water dripped into living spaces, ran down walls, and warped wooden beams. The smell of damp, earthy, musty, ever-present, became part of the winter air indoors. Bedding had to be dried carefully near the fire, or else it would develop a persistent mildew that clung to fabric and skin alike. Travel within the city slowed during the rains. Heavy carts bogged down in muddy side streets, and merchants delayed deliveries if possible. Public gatherings became rare. The open-air forum, normally buzzing with voices, was often half empty. The citizens huddled under their cloaks or taking shelter beneath the porticos. Even the most persistent traders could be driven indoors when the rain poured in relentless sheets. There were moments, however, when the rains lent the city a strange beauty. The stone of the great monuments gleamed darkly, their carvings catching the glint of water. Pools formed in the ruts of ancient streets, reflecting torchlight at night like trembling fragments of gold. The sound of rain against tile roofs was a steady, almost hypnotic backdrop, lulling some to sleep despite the chill in the air. But beauty was small comfort when the river rose too high. Floods could sweep away animals, tear loose market stalls, and undermine the foundations of bridges. The wooden ponds, Sublicious Rome's oldest bridge, had to be constantly maintained, and even then, floodwaters sometimes forced the removal of certain sections to prevent its total destruction. The stone bridges, triumphs of Roman engineering, fared better, but they too could be blocked with debris, creating dangerous pressure points in the current. The city learned to live with the Tiber's moods. Temples were raised on higher ground. Warehouses were built with upper storage floors for valuable goods. But every winter the old stories resurfaced. Tales of years when the river rose so high it washed into the Forum itself, drowning the lower streets and sending citizens scrambling to the hills. If you lived in Rome during such a winter, you never forgot the power of the river. The rains might stop, the sun might break through, but the Tiber would always remind you that it could rise again. And in a city that prided itself on mastery over nature, The river was a reminder that some forces could not be conquered, only endured. Winter in ancient Rome was not just a test of comfort, it was a test of the body. The cold, the damp, the smoke-filled rooms, and the unpredictable rains all worked together to weaken even the healthiest citizen. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics or vaccines, a simple cough could become a lasting illness, and a fever could turn fatal. The Romans did not have a clear understanding of germs, but they knew the seasons brought changes in health. Winter was the season of catarrhs, heavy congestion of the nose and throat, and of lingering coughs that echoed through the narrow streets. The cold, wet air aggravated joint pain in the elderly, while the damp encouraged skin ailments and slow-healing sores. In the poorest quarters, where several families might share a single room, illness spread quickly, moving from child to child, then to parents, then to neighbors. Doctors existed, Medici trained in the traditions of Greek medicine, but they were costly. Wealthy households might retain a physician year-round, ensuring prompt treatment for any sickness. The poor, however, relied on home remedies, superstition, and the advice of herbalists or midwives. Honey and vinegar mixtures were drunk for sore throats, warm compresses were applied to aching chests, and herbal teas made from thyme, rosemary, or fennel were believed to ease coughs. Still, the greatest enemy in winter was not the cough itself. It was what came after. A deep, rattling chest illness, what we might now call pneumonia, could strike suddenly, especially after prolonged exposure to the cold. Without antibiotics, recovery was uncertain, and the combination of weakness, poor nutrition, and damp living conditions could quickly overwhelm the body. There was also the ever-present risk of fevers. The Romans classified fevers in many ways: quotidiana, coming daily; tertiana, every third day; quartan, every fourth. But these were observations, not cures. Some fevers may have been malaria, lingering from the mosquito-filled marshes near the city. Others were likely influenza-like viruses that spread in the crowded winter months. Even minor wounds became more dangerous in the cold season. A cut to the hand could fester if kept damp and dirty, leading to infection and sometimes death. Romans did use wine and vinegar as disinfectants, but without knowledge of bacteria, they could not always prevent the worst. In the absence of certainty, many turned to ritual and superstition. Amulets were worn to ward off sickness, prayers offered to Aesculapius, the god of healing. Some visited the temple of Fortuna hoping for better health through divine favor. The belief that illness could be driven away by the gods gave comfort, even if it did not cure. And yet, Romans endured. Endurance was a virtue in itself, the virtues of standing firm against hardship. Winter tested that endurance daily. You might wake with a cough, work in the cold until your fingers were numb, return to a smoke-filled room, and still rise again the next day to do the same. For the poor, there was no alternative. To stop working was to risk starvation. Children were particularly vulnerable, their smaller bodies less able to withstand the cold. Infant mortality was already high in Rome, and winter raised the danger further. Many families had stories of siblings or children lost in the cold season, and such losses were accepted with a stoic sorrow that modern ears might find unthinkable. Life was fragile, and death was never far from the Roman mind. Yet amid this hardship, community played its part in survival. Neighbors shared remedies, checked in on the sick, and sometimes shared food or fuel for warmth. A small act, a bowl of hot pools, a piece of bread, a handful of coals, could mean the difference between recovery and decline. In this way, the Romans' famed social bonds became a form of medicine. As winter deepened, those who survived learned to read their bodies, to sense the first warning signs of illness, and to guard against them. They might wear extra layers of wool, drink warm wine with herbs, or spend more hours near the public baths, letting the steam and heat work through their lungs. There was no guarantee of health, only a constant, quiet struggle to maintain it until spring returned. When the cold winds rolled down from the hills and the damp air settled over Rome, there was one place where warmth could always be found: the public baths. To the Romans, the thermae were more than a place to wash. They were a daily ritual, a social hub, and in winter, a refuge from the season's relentless chill. By the height of the empire, great bath complexes like those of Caracalla and Diocletian were marvels of engineering and design, but even in earlier centuries, smaller neighborhood baths served the same essential purpose. For a few coins, sometimes even free if a wealthy patron sponsored the day, you could step out of the biting air and into a space of steam, warmth, and light. The process began in the appoditorium, the changing room. Here, citizens removed their outer garments, storing them in niches along the wall or entrusting them to an attendant. In winter, this moment could be bracing, stepping from woolen layers into bare skin, while the air still clung cold to the stone walls. But beyond this threshold lay the tepidarium, the warm room where the transition to comfort began. The tepidarium was heated gently, its floor warmed by the hypocaust system, an ingenious network of raised floors and hollow walls through which hot air from a furnace flowed. This space was meant to acclimate the body, allowing muscles to loosen and skin to flush with returning warmth. The air was scented faintly with oil and damp stone, and the murmur of voices echoed softly beneath vaulted ceilings. From there, bathers could move to the caldarium, the hot room. Here, the heat was intense, almost shocking after the cool outside air. Steam rose from a great basin of hot water, fed by lead pipes from the furnace-heated tanks. The floor radiated heat underfoot, and the walls seemed to hold the warmth like a living thing. Romans would sit or stand here, sweating freely, sometimes rubbing oil into their skin before scraping it away with a curved bronze tool called a strigil. In the depths of winter, the caldarium was more than luxury, it was therapy. The heat drove out the dampness that clung to joints and bones, easing pain and stiffness. For those recovering from winter coughs, the steam soothed throats and loosened phlegm. Men might linger here for long stretches, chatting lazily or simply sitting in silence as the steam wrapped around them. After the heat came the shock, the frigidarium, the cold plunge. Even in winter, Romans believed this sudden immersion was invigorating, tightening the skin and sealing in health. The water was unheated, and the first step into its depths could make even the most stoic gasp aloud. Some skipped this entirely in the cold season, but many swore by it, claiming it warded off sickness. The baths were not just about the body, they were about the mind and spirit as well. In winter, when the streets were grey and sodden, the baths were bright and alive. The air buzzed with talk. News of the forum, political gossip, stories from travelers. Merchants discussed deals. Philosophers debated. Friends arranged dinners. The heat broke down barriers. Senators and shopkeepers alike might sit side by side on the stone benches, stripped to the same vulnerability. For the poor, the baths were a blessing. Few could afford the luxury of constant fuel at home, so the thermae offered a place to warm the body thoroughly each day. Here, they could wash the grime of winter from their skin, loosen aching muscles, and enjoy the kind of heat their homes could never hold. But the baths also carried their risks. In winter, when illness spread easily, the close quarters and shared air could transmit sickness as much as prevent it. The damp floors could harbor fungus, the communal sponges and towels, unseen infections. Yet for most Romans, the benefits far outweighed the dangers. The baths were part of what made life in the city bearable, even pleasant, during the cold months. As evening fell and bathers emerged once more into the chill air, their skin glowed warm and steam curled from their hair. The city might still be damp and cold, but for a few hours, the harshness of winter had been held at bay by heat, stone, and water. And tomorrow, the thermae would welcome them again, as they had welcomed Romans for centuries. Through every winter the city had known. In the grand public baths, warmth was plentiful, almost decadent, but in the homes of ancient Rome, especially in the cramped, drafty insulae where most of the population lived, the fight against winter's chill was an entirely different matter. Here, heat was a precious commodity, rationed carefully, and the struggle to keep it was one of the daily battles of the cold season. Roman houses, whether the tall apartment blocks of the poor or the spacious domus of the wealthy, were not built with insulation in mind. The walls were thick, yes, but stone and brick absorbed cold as easily as they held heat in summer. In winter, these walls became repositories for dampness, drawing moisture from the air and passing it into the rooms. The idea of a cozy, sealed space simply did not exist. Drafts found their way through every crack, and the heavy rains of January could make even the interior floors feel clammy beneath bare feet. For most, warmth came from a small brazier, a portable, open container of bronze or clay in which charcoal or wood was burned. The Romans called it a faculus. It was an ancient design, simple and effective in concept, but it carried dangers. Charcoal fires produced carbon monoxide, and in the enclosed rooms of winter, this invisible threat could kill as easily as the cold. Ventilation was necessary, but ventilation meant letting in more freezing air. It was a constant trade-off between safety and comfort. The wealthiest homes had more elaborate heating systems. Some possessed a private hypocaust, the same underfloor heating system used in the baths. These were rare and expensive to run, requiring a constant supply of fuel and the labor of slaves to maintain the fires. More commonly, wealthier Romans had large hearths, fireplaces built into the walls where wood could be burned, and the warmth radiated outward. Still, even these could only heat a portion of the house. Fuel itself was a major concern. Rome did not sit amid endless forests. Timber had to be brought in from the countryside, and in winter, demand was high. Wood could be expensive, particularly good hardwoods that burned longer and hotter. The poor often resorted to scavenging scraps, burning sticks, old furniture, or even dried dung when nothing else could be found. Charcoal, a cleaner burning fuel, was more efficient but also costly. Many families could only afford it in small quantities, using it sparingly to heat water for cooking or to keep a brazier going for a few hours in the evening. The smell of burning fuel in winter was as much a part of Rome as the sight of steam rising from the baths. Walk down a street after dusk, and you would smell a mixture of wood smoke, damp stone, and the faint acrid scent of charcoal drifting from the windows and doorways. These fires were the beating hearts of households in the cold months. Around them, people gathered to eat, talk, and do their work, all within the limited circle of warmth they offered. The fire was also a source of light in the longer nights. Oil lamps and candles supplemented it, but the flicker of flames from a brazier or hearth gave a sense of life that was more than practical. In the dark, when the wind pressed against the shutters, the glow of a fire was a reassurance that the household was holding out against the season. Still, for all this effort, most Romans lived with a constant undercurrent of cold in winter. You might warm your hands at the brazier, but your feet would still be chilled from the unheated floors. Your bed might be piled with blankets and animal skins, but the air you breathed would still carry the bite of the outside. Even the wealthy, with their greater resources, could not create the kind of all-encompassing warmth that we take for granted today. The cold shaped daily life in subtle ways. People wore layered tunics indoors, adding cloaks when moving from one room to another. Work that could be done close to the fire was preferred. Food and drink were chosen for their heat, steaming bowls of pools or cups of warmed wine infused with spices. And social life moved to places where warmth could be found: the baths, the taverns, the homes of friends with better fuel supplies. Fire was both friend and foe. Without it, winter in Rome could be unbearable. With it, there was comfort, but also risk, of smoke, of burns, of poisoning, and of the ever-present danger of fire spreading through the crowded, flammable insulae. It was a fine balance, and one the Romans had learned to navigate through long habit. In the end, warmth was never permanent. Fires burned out, fuel ran low, night returned with its cold breath, and so, each day of winter, the battle for heat began anew, a reminder that survival in ancient Rome was not just about the grand spectacles of history, but about the quiet, relentless work of keeping body and spirit alive in the season's grip. In the Roman imagination, food was not just sustenance, it was a marker of civilization. But in winter, even in the heart of the empire, the abundance we picture from lavish banquets gave way to something far more practical. The cold months demanded planning, preservation, and adaptation. Without the ability to store fresh produce year-round, Romans relied on whatever could survive the season, and whatever they had had the foresight to prepare during the warmth of summer and autumn. The Roman diet in winter began with grain, the foundation of survival. Wheat was the staple, milled into flour and baked into bread or boiled into a porridge called pools. Bread was the daily anchor of the table, eaten at nearly every meal. For the poor, coarse bread made from cheaper grains like barley was common, dense and filling, if not particularly pleasant. For the wealthy, fine white bread from well-sifted flour was a small luxury in the long season. Vegetables, so plentiful in the growing months, had to be stored carefully. The Romans were skilled at pickling, salting, and drying produce to make it last. Olives, harvested in late autumn, were cured in brine and kept in large clay jars. Cabbage and other hardy greens could survive into the early winter, but once the frosts deepened, most fresh vegetables disappeared from the markets. Instead, people relied on preserved beans, lentils, and chickpeas, foods that could be boiled into thick stews, warming both body and spirit. Fruits were a rare treat in the dead of winter. Grapes, figs, and apples could be dried and stored, and some fruits, like pomegranates, would last for weeks if kept in cool, dry conditions. Wealthy households with more resources could import citrus fruits from warmer provinces, but for most Romans, the sweetness of dried figs or raisins was as good as it got until spring. Meat was not as common as one might think, especially for the urban poor. While the wealthy could feast on roasted boar or stewed lamb, even in January, poorer citizens relied more on cured meats, sausages, or small amounts of pork fat to flavor otherwise plain dishes. Fresh meat was expensive and had to be eaten quickly before it spoiled, unless it was smoked, salted, or dried. The winter season, with its colder temperatures, helped a little with preservation, but the challenge of keeping food safe was constant. Fish, both fresh and preserved, played a key role in the winter diet. Salted fish from Spain and North Africa were shipped in large quantities to Rome, and the pungent fish sauce known as garum flavored meals across every class of society. It was an acquired taste, sharp, salty, and rich, but it transformed otherwise plain winter dishes into something more satisfying. Cooking in winter was as much about conserving heat as it was about preparing food. Families would gather near the brazier or hearth, placing pots directly over the coals or into the embers. Stews were common because they could simmer slowly, filling the air with rich scents and stretching small amounts of meat or vegetables into a meal for many. Bread, when fresh, was eaten warm from the oven. When stale, it was soaked in broth or wine to soften it. For those with means, winter also brought its own indulgences. The wealthy could enjoy imported spices, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, which were brought to Rome through long costly trade routes from India and beyond. These spices were not merely for flavor. They were believed to have warming properties, making them perfect for the season. Hot wine infused with honey and spices, called malsum, was a popular drink at winter gatherings. Street food also played its part. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts, grilled sausages, and steaming bowls of beans in the markets and along the busy fairs. The smell of these simple foods, carried through the cold air, could draw a crowd quickly. For many, buying a hot snack from a street stall was not just about eating. It was a way to warm their hands and faces for a few precious minutes. Still, hunger was a reality in the winter months, especially for those at the bottom of the social ladder. The unknown Rome's grain dole provided a lifeline for many citizens, but it did not solve every problem. A steady supply of bread kept starvation at bay, but it could not replace the variety and nutrition of a more balanced diet. Malnutrition, illness, and weakness were constant companions for the poor in winter. In the kitchens of Rome, from the smoky corners of insulae to the grand dining halls of the elite, winter meals told the story of survival. They were not always extravagant or beautiful, but they were purposeful. Every jar of olives, every loaf of bread, every pot of lentils was a quiet victory against the season, and in the flickering light of the brazier, with the scent of something hot and savory in the air, even the harsh Roman winter could be met with a full belly and a little comfort. If you imagine ancient Rome, you might picture sunlit streets, white togas, and warm Mediterranean breezes. But Rome in winter was a different world, damp, bone-chilling, and full of icy drafts that could slip through stone walls and open doorways. Surviving the season meant dressing for endurance, and Romans, though not blessed with modern coats or waterproof boots, developed their own strategies for layering, insulating, and braving the cold. At the core of winter clothing was the tunic, the everyday garment worn by nearly every Roman, regardless of class. Made from wool in the cold months, the tunic was a simple knee-length or ankle-length piece, belted at the waist. For winter, the wool was thicker, often coarser, and sometimes layered, one tunic worn over another. Wealthier citizens could afford softer, finely woven wool, dyed in subtle colors or edged with decorative stitching. Poorer citizens made do with rougher fabrics, often reused and patched until nearly threadbare. Over the tunic came the cloak, a vital barrier against the wind and rain. The most common winter cloak was the piennula, a heavy, poncho-like garment with a hood. Made from thick, felted wool, it could shed light rain and trap body heat, making it indispensable for travel and outdoor work. The piennula was not elegant, but it was practical. Wealthy Romans, however, often favored the lacerna, a large, flowing cloak fastened at one shoulder with a fibula, a decorative brooch. While it provided warmth, the lacerna was as much a display of style as a shield against the weather. For soldiers, travelers, and those working in exposed conditions, the sogum was the cloak of choice. Worn by the Roman military, the sogum was a thick, rectangular wool blanket wrapped around the body and secured with a pin. It was heavy, durable, and designed for endurance rather than elegance. Many civilian laborers adopted similar cloaks during winter, finding them cheap, effective, and easy to repair. Footwear in winter posed its own challenges. The standard Roman sandal, the calceus or caliga, left too much of the foot exposed for true warmth. In the cold months, people often lined their footwear with felt or wool, and in wet conditions, they might wear thicker, closed shoes of leather. Socks, yes, the Romans had them, were made from woven wool and pulled up to the calves. Archaeological finds in Roman Egypt have even uncovered colorful toe-split socks designed to be worn with sandals. The head and hands were not ignored. While most Roman fashion avoided hats, in winter the hood of a pianula or a wrapped scarf served to protect the ears and neck. Gloves were rare, but not unknown, especially for those handling tools outdoors in the cold. More often, Romans warmed their hands inside their cloaks or held them near a brazier. The wealthy could indulge in imported fabrics to enhance winter comfort. Cloaks lined with fur from fox, hare, or even exotic animals were prized, though such luxuries were out of reach for the average citizen. For most Romans, warmth depended on the quality of their wool, and on how many layers they could afford. Color also played a role. In the cold months, darker colors were common, not only because they were practical for hiding dirt, but also because certain dyes adhered better to heavier wool. Reds, browns, deep greens, and undyed grays were seen everywhere in winter. For the elite, the rarest and most expensive dye, Tyrian purple, remained a statement of wealth and rank. Even when worked into heavier fabrics, the act of dressing for winter in Rome was often dictated by necessity rather than comfort. If you were poor, you wore what you had, patched and layered as best you could. If you were wealthy, you dressed in layers not only to stay warm, but to maintain appearances in public. Regardless of class, the key was insulation, trapping heat against the body while keeping out damp and wind. Indoors, clothing remained important. Roman homes, especially in the poorer districts, were not heated beyond the small brazier or hearth. People kept their cloaks on indoors, wrapped themselves in blankets, or wore extra tunics. The elite, living in larger houses with more drafty rooms, often relied on portable braziers and layers of fine wool garments to stay comfortable. It's worth noting that Rome's climate, though milder than northern Europe's, could still be severe. Cold rains, sudden frosts, and even occasional snow in the hills meant that underestimating winter was dangerous. Proper clothing was not just a matter of fashion, it was a matter of survival. Thus, as you picture a Roman winter, think less of airy white togas and more of bundled figures and heavy wool cloaks, hoods drawn low, boots wrapped in cloth, their breath clouding the damp morning air. Whether senator or laborer, soldier or shopkeeper, every Roman knew the simple truth. In the depths of winter, dignity was nice, but warmth was essential. In the popular imagination, Rome's roads were marvels of engineering, straight, paved, and enduring for centuries. And that image is true. In summer, in winter, however, even the finest Roman road could become a treacherous, miserable gauntlet. Rain was the great enemy. While the famed stone-paved via shed water better than dirt tracks, they were not immune to the season's hazards. In heavy downpours, the grooves worn by wagon wheels filled with water, and the smooth stones became slick underfoot, turning a simple walk into a careful dance. For most Romans, travel in winter was something to be avoided if possible. The days were short, the weather unpredictable, and the cold seeped into the bones. Merchants who had crisscrossed the countryside in warmer months slowed their operations, relying instead on local trade. Couriers and messengers still moved. News and official orders could not wait for spring, but their journeys were harder and longer. The countryside presented its own hazards. Dirt roads in rural areas turned to thick mud after even a single day of rain, bogging down carts and exhausting the animals pulling them. In some low-lying areas, the roads became rivers, forcing travelers to wait or risk dangerous crossings. The Romans had built many bridges, but smaller wooden ones could be damaged or swept away by swollen streams. Snow was rare in the city itself, but not in the hills and mountains of the empire. The Apennines could see heavy snowfalls, and mountain passes became perilous, for soldiers, traders, or officials moving between Italy's regions. This meant delays, detours, or outright halts until conditions improved. Inns in these areas did brisk business in winter, offering shelter to stranded travelers, though the warmth came at a price. Speaking of inns, the coponi and mansionese that dotted the roads became essential refuges. The coponi were private, often humble establishments, where a traveler could get a hot meal, a bed sometimes shared, and a roof over their head. They were not famed for comfort. The bedding could be infested, and the food was often as bland as it was overpriced. But in winter, even a smoky, noisy inn was better than the open road. The mansionese run by the state served official travelers, offering more reliable shelter but still basic accommodations. For those with the means, travel by covered carriage or litter offered some protection from the weather. Wealthy Romans might wrap themselves in heavy cloaks, bring along portable braziers, or carry food and wine to make the journey more bearable. But these luxuries could not change the fact that winter slowed everything. Even the fastest couriers could be delayed by washed-out roads or frozen streams. Animals also suffered. Horses and mules needed more feed in winter, as grazing was scarce. Oxen pulling carts moved slower on slippery roads, and even the hardiest beasts could falter in deep mud or icy conditions. For this reason, many farmers timed their market trips to avoid the worst weather, sometimes traveling only once every few weeks. The perils of winter travel were not only natural. Banditry tended to rise in the colder months, particularly along less patrolled rural roads. Desperation drove some to rob travelers, knowing that food, clothing, and coin were in short supply. While the Roman state worked to keep major roads secure, isolated stretches were another matter. In the city, the roads posed their own dangers. Rainwater mixed with waste, turning the streets into slippery, foul-smelling hazards. Stepping stones helped pedestrians cross, but the gaps between them were treacherous for the unwary. Carts splashed passers-by, and icy patches in shaded alleys caught many off guard. Navigating Rome in winter was an exercise in constant vigilance and dirty boots. Yet travel could not simply stop. Soldiers rotated posts, tax collectors visited the provinces, messengers carried letters from one end of the empire to the other. Even in the depths of January, the roads were never empty. The difference was that in winter, travel was about endurance, not speed. You moved slower, you planned for delays, and you prayed to the gods for a stretch of clear weather. And so, despite their brilliant engineering, the Roman roads in winter were a test of patience, strength, and will. The same highways that had carried armies to victory and merchants to fortune became, in the damp and cold months, a reminder that even the mightiest empire could not control the seasons. In ancient Rome, surviving the long cold winter months depended as much on preparation as on endurance. Without refrigerators or freezers, keeping food edible and nutritious through weeks of cold and damp was a challenge that demanded creativity, skill, and sometimes a little luck. The Romans developed an array of preservation techniques and storage solutions that allowed their winter pantries to endure when fresh fields lay barren. The most common preservation method was drying. Fruits like figs, grapes as raisins, and apples were sliced thin and left to dry in the sun during the warmer months, their sugars concentrating as moisture vanished. Once dried, these fruits could be stored in sealed clay jars or woven baskets lined with leaves, protecting them from pests and humidity. Dried fruits were prized winter treats, sweet bites to break the monotony of porridge, and salted meats. Salting was another cornerstone of Roman food preservation. Salt, a precious commodity in itself, was applied to meats and fish to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth. Large cuts of pork or beef were cured with generous layers of salt, then hung in cool, airy spaces called horia, granary-like storage rooms designed to keep goods dry and away from rodents. Salted fish, especially anchovies and mackerel, were common fare, and their pungent smell was familiar to every Roman household. In addition to salting, the Romans used smoking to extend the life of meat and fish. By hanging cuts above smoky fires in specially designed smokehouses or simple wooden frames, the drying and chemical effects of smoke preserved the flesh. Smoked sausages and ham-like cuts were staples for winter eating, as they kept longer and provided concentrated flavors that enlivened otherwise plain dishes. Pickling was also well known. Vegetables such as cabbage, turnips, and cucumbers were immersed in vinegar or brine solutions, transforming them into sharp, sour accompaniments that could last through the months. These pickled goods added variety to the winter diet, and were valued for their tangy, refreshing bite. Storage was as important as preparation. Roman pantries were carefully designed for cool, dry conditions. The dolia, large earthenware jars with wide mouths, were used to store grains, olives, and preserved fruits. They could be sealed with wax or cloth to keep out moisture and pests. Smaller jars held oil and honey, both natural preservatives that kept foods edible longer and added richness to winter meals. In wealthier homes, underground cellars provided a naturally cool environment to store food. These spaces remained at a fairly constant temperature year-round, protecting goods from the heat and dampness above. In poorer households, clever use of shaded corners, Thick walls, or tightly woven baskets, helped keep food away from direct sunlight and fluctuating temperatures. Honey, more than just a sweetener, was itself a preservative. Romans stored fruits and even some meats submerged in honey to extend their shelf life. The ancient understanding of honey's antibacterial properties made it invaluable in the winter pantry. Water preservation was also a concern. Wells and aqueducts supplied the city, but in winter, water could become cold and unpleasant. Romans sometimes stored water in earthenware vessels buried in the ground, allowing the earth to insulate and keep it cool but not freezing. But despite these efforts, winter food stores were never guaranteed. Sudden thaws or damp conditions could cause mold and spoilage, ruining precious reserves. Rodents and insects were constant threats, especially in crowded urban areas where hygiene was often poor. Theft was also a problem. Neighbors might pilfer a jar of olives or a sack of grain during hard times. Preparation began in the warm months with careful harvesting and curing. But it was winter that tested these preparations. The smell of drying meat, the sharp tang of pickled vegetables, and the faint sweetness of honey-dipped fruit were the signs that survival was still possible. Each meal was a quiet triumph over the season's hardships, a testament to Roman ingenuity and resilience. In the dim kitchens and bustling markets of Rome, the art of preservation was a form of hope. It promised that even as winter closed its grip, the city's tables would not be bare, and the people, rich and poor alike, could endure another cold season. Winter in ancient Rome was not only a season of hardship, but also one marked by a unique rhythm of social life, festivals, and pauses from labor. As the cold settled in and the days shortened, Romans adapted their routines to the season, weaving moments of rest and celebration into the otherwise grueling fight for survival. One of the most important winter festivals was Saturnalia, held in mid-December, honoring the god Saturn. For several days, the city's usual strict social order was relaxed. Masters served their slaves, gifts were exchanged, and feasting and merrymaking filled homes and public spaces. The festival was a crucial psychological break, a reminder that even amid winter's challenges, joy and community persisted. The lights of candles and the smell of roasted meats filled the air, offering warmth that transcended the physical. Beyond Saturnalia, smaller festivals and religious observances dotted the winter months. The Compitalia, celebrating the household gods, involved offerings and prayers at crossroads shrines, seeking protection during the dark days. Many Romans believed these rites helped guard against illness and misfortune, crucial in a season when vulnerability was high. Winter was also a time when work slowed for many. Agricultural labor, so central in warmer months, paused. Fields lay fallow under the frost, and animals were sheltered from the worst of the cold. In the city, construction projects often halted, and merchants slowed their activity. This lull gave space for rest, repair, and planning for the coming spring. Yet, for most, rest was limited. The poor, lacking the resources to stockpile enough food or fuel, faced long days of struggle. They worked whenever possible, gathering wood, mending clothes, or selling small goods in the markets. The cold made these tasks harder, but they were essential to survival. Public spaces like the baths and taverns became centers of social life during winter. In the warmth of the thermae, Romans shared news and gossip, while taverns offered heated rooms and strong wine to chase away the chill. For many, these places were vital refuges from loneliness and hardship. In wealthy homes, winter evenings were often spent around fires, with families and guests sharing stories, music, and philosophical debates. The long nights lent themselves to reflection and bonding, and the contrast between indoor warmth and outdoor cold made these moments especially treasured. Children, whose outdoor play was limited by the cold, learned from elders through storytelling and simple crafts. Education and training continued, but often indoors, where the risks of illness from exposure were lessened. Despite the difficulties, the winter's social calendar reflected a community adapting to the seasons. It was a time when shared rituals and moments of respite reminded Romans of their resilience and their connections to each other and to the divine, while the grandeur of Rome's marble temples and bustling forums conjures images of imperial power and wealth. The reality for most inhabitants was far grimmer, especially in winter. The city's poorest residents lived in crowded, poorly maintained insulae, apartment buildings that were cramped, drafty, and dangerously susceptible to cold and damp. In winter, these slums became places of suffering and survival against relentless hardship. These multi-story buildings, often built quickly and cheaply to house the swelling population, had thin walls and little insulation. The narrow streets between them funneled cold winds, and rain seeped through cracked roofs and open windows. Fire was a constant threat, yet without sufficient heating, residents shivered through long nights. Families might crowd into single rooms, huddling close for warmth, surrounded by the smells of unwashed bodies, cooking fires, and stagnant waste. Sanitation in these neighborhoods was notoriously poor. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best, with cesspits frequently overflowing. During winter rains, gutters and streets flooded with refuse, spreading filth and disease. The damp conditions fostered respiratory infections, tuberculosis, and other illnesses that thrived in cold, crowded environments. For children, the risk was even higher. Infant mortality rates soared in winter months, a tragic reality accepted by many. Access to clean water was limited. Wells in these districts were often contaminated, and public fountains might be too far or crowded to reach easily, especially in the cold. This scarcity made simple hygiene difficult, further compounding health risks. Bathing, a cornerstone of Roman culture, became a luxury few poor could afford regularly in winter, when travel to public baths required time and coins. Food insecurity was acute. The city's grain dole provided some relief, but it was never sufficient to meet everyone's needs. Many families subsisted on stale bread, watery gruel, or pickled vegetables, lacking fresh ingredients that could bolster nutrition and immunity. Starvation and malnutrition weakened bodies against the winter cold and disease. Employment in winter was scarce. Outdoor jobs, construction, farming, street vending slowed or ceased, leaving many without income. Some turned to begging or illicit activities to survive, risking punishment or exploitation. The harshness of the season intensified social tensions, and crime rates often rose in impoverished areas. Despite these conditions, community bonds could be strong. Neighbors shared what little they had, cared for the sick, and gathered for prayers or small festivals to maintain hope. Informal networks provided food, clothing, or shelter for those in dire need, offering fragile lifelines amid adversity. Winter also exposed the failures of the Roman state's infrastructure and social policies. Efforts to provide grain, maintain public order, and manage urban sanitation were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of poverty. Political debates about how to address these issues were ongoing, but practical solutions remained limited. For the residents of Rome's slums, winter was a season of endurance rather than celebration. Every day was a struggle to stay warm, stay fed, and stay alive. The cold was not just a physical challenge, it was a reminder of social divides, of vulnerability, and of a city that gleamed in marble yet harbored darkness in its shadowed alleys. Winter in ancient Rome was not just cold and dark, it was also a time when nature's fury could wreak havoc on the city and countryside alike. The Mediterranean climate, while milder than northern Europe's, still brought fierce storms, heavy rains, and flooding that tested the resilience of Rome's people and infrastructure. Preparation was essential, and the Romans had developed strategies, sometimes ingenious, sometimes desperate, to face these seasonal challenges. Rain was the defining feature of the Roman winter. Unlike the dry heat of summer, the months from November through February could be saturated with relentless downpours. Streets turned to rivers, carrying refuse and mud in torrents that swept through the city's narrow alleys. The famous Roman drainage systems, such as the Cloaca Maxima, worked tirelessly to carry water away, but even these massive sewers could be overwhelmed in extreme weather. To protect their homes, Romans took several measures. Wealthier citizens sealed their windows with wooden shutters and heavy curtains to keep the wind and rain out. Roofs were constructed with overlapping tiles designed to channel water downward, but leaks were common, especially in older or poorly maintained buildings. In slums and poorer neighborhoods, temporary repairs using straw or cloth patched holes, but these were often ineffective against long storms. Flooding was particularly feared near the Tiber River. The river's banks could swell rapidly after heavy rains, spilling water into the city's lowest quarters. Ancient texts and inscriptions warn of these floods, describing the anxiety they caused and the damage left in their wake. Citizens in flood-prone areas reinforced walls, piled sandbags, and moved valuable goods to higher ground when warned of rising waters. The city also relied on public works. The Romans maintained aqueducts and canals to manage water flow, and during the wet season, workers were tasked with clearing drains and removing blockages to prevent backups. Roads were raised or repaired regularly to avoid becoming impassable mud traps. These civic efforts were vital but never guaranteed success. Nature's power often outpaced human engineering. Beyond the city, Rural Romans faced their own challenges. Farmhouses and granaries were vulnerable to water damage, which could ruin stored crops and seeds needed for spring planting. Farmers used raised platforms and stone foundations to protect structures, and stored grain in sealed containers to keep moisture at bay. Fields became waterlogged, delaying sowing and threatening food production. Storms could bring more than just water. Lightning strikes ignited fires in wooden buildings or thatched roofs, and strong winds could topple trees and damage property. In the city, the noise of thunder and howling wind was a constant reminder of the season's dangers. Adding to the general winter gloom, preparation extended to the people themselves. Romans stocked up on supplies, oil for lamps, extra fuel for fires, preserved foods, knowing that severe weather could isolate them or limit access to markets. Neighbors helped one another, sharing resources and information about upcoming storms or flooding risks. Priests and augurs might perform rituals seeking divine protection from destructive weather, blending practical preparation with spiritual hope. Despite all these efforts, winter storms and floods could be devastating. Damage to homes and infrastructure caused economic hardship, displaced family, and worsened public health by spreading disease through contaminated water. The cold, wet conditions also made recovery slow and painful. The Romans' struggle against winter storms reminds us that even the mightiest empire was vulnerable to nature's cycles. The city's grandeur was no shield against rain and flood. Survival depended on resilience, community, and the endless work of adaptation. As the winds rattled windows and the Tiber swelled beyond its banks, Romans faced winter not as conquerors, but as humans enduring the season's raw power. As winter's grip finally began to loosen and the days slowly stretched toward spring, Romans took a moment to reflect on the long season just endured. The bitter cold, the dampness seeping into stone and bone, the daily fight to find warmth, food, and safety. All these shaped the experience of living in ancient Rome far more deeply than the grandeur of its monuments or the thrill of its politics. To survive a single winter was an achievement, and to endure many was a testament to human resilience amid relentless challenge. Winter was a season that humbled everyone. The elite, wrapped in furs and protected by servants and fire-heated rooms, still felt the bite of cold creeping into their villas. The poor, cramped into their damp insulae, faced every day with uncertainty. Will there be enough food? Will the fire burn long enough? Will illness take one more victim? The harshness of winter cut across social lines. Though the wealthy had many advantages, for most, survival was never guaranteed. The season's difficulties forged rhythms of life and community. Shared struggles fostered solidarity among neighbors, even as cold and scarcity bred tension. Rituals, festivals, and daily routines all became adaptations, ways to impose order on the chaotic forces of nature. The very act of waking each morning and facing the chill was a quiet defiance, a refusal to succumb. The physical toll was immense. Respiratory illnesses surged, and the malnutrition of winter weakened bodies. Fires, while sources of warmth, also posed dangers of smoke inhalation and destruction. Roads slowed to muddy misery, trade stalled, and labor paused. Yet the city pulsed on, a living organism adapting to each season's demands. Perhaps most striking is how invisible winter's hardships are to us today. When we think of Rome, we see marble temples, grand forums, shining armor, and emperors draped in purple. We forget that beneath that veneer was a world where simply staying warm was a daily battle. This was a civilization intimately tied to its environment, vulnerable, resourceful, and human. To imagine surviving a single Roman winter is to appreciate the small victories. A fire that does not go out, a meal hot enough to thaw frozen fingers, a cloak wrapped tightly against a damp wind. It is to understand that history is not just about great events, but about millions of ordinary lives, quietly enduring through the seasons. As you drift to sleep, think of those Romans' children, mothers, soldiers, laborers gathered around flickering fires, listening to the wind outside, holding close what little comfort they could muster. Their story is a reminder that beneath the grand sweep of history lies the slow, steady pulse of survival.